This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, first thing to say again is tremendous gratitude to the people who've put this on, and indeed the people who've spoken at it, and the extreme professionalism of everything up till now is now going to collapse. As I'm very grateful to all speakers, as inevitably in a conference like this, these are terribly difficult papers to write after all, as none of us are experts on anything more than a very small part of it. Such a vast area, and some of us are experts on no part of it at all. The way in which we've been given enough to contextualize these various different bits and then see what the punchy extra arguments that everybody's been bringing has been terrifically helpful and illuminating. And my job is just to speak for a few minutes, I think, and just try and bring some things together. And there's been so much in the air, it's really very hard to bring things together, I suppose. Perhaps just starting from the question that Fran mentioned, the phrase used by Simon Goldhill of why read Plutarch, why Plutarch? Perhaps why go to Plutarch? What has come out about the reasons why different cultures, different periods might have gone to Plutarch rather than anybody else, and indeed some periods rather more than others. Perhaps this might be interesting to see whatever answer we give to those sort of questions, or answers, how much they might map onto the recent growth in Plutarch scholarship, what some people call the Plutarch bubble. I remember there was a very interesting piece by Walter Scheidel back in 1997, plotting the bulk of scholarship on different authors, comparing the proportions of scholarship spent on each author between, I think he took years ending in 1932, 42, 52, 62, up to 1992. And it emerged that everything was really pretty constant, with the exception of Plutarch. And Plutarch was the one author that had really mushroomed. Is that a fluke of the statistics, he asked. No, no, Walter, it isn't. Admittedly, 1992 was the year of ANRW in Plutarch. That may have had something to do with it. But evidently, the growth of Plutarch has mushroomed a great deal. There are all sorts of reasons that it may have mushroomed. One of it has been evidently the discovery that Plutarch does a lot more in his philosophical thinking, in his narrative technique, than people might have thought before, that he's a very interesting mind, brain, hand of his own. Some of it increasingly perhaps has been a greater interest in Plutarch as a historical figure, as a historical source, but not necessarily for the things, or only for the things he's writing about, but also for the mindset, the intellectual context of his day. So Peter, in his introductory remarks yesterday, talked about Montaigne being attracted by Plutarch because of that window into the ancient world. Perhaps it is a bit of a window into the ancient world, but it's a window that may tell on a slightly different part of the ancient world than we had thought. But anyway, what sort of reasons have driven different cultures to Plutarch? Some things are clear: the attractive style, the storytelling, the anecdotes, the exemplarity, I suppose, particularly. One recurrent theme has been the self-fashioning element, the way in which readers of Plutarch have found themselves modelling not merely on the people that Plutarch is talking about, perhaps not merely indeed on the practical philosophy that Liewe van Hoof and Fred Schurink were talking about as well, but on the Plutarch that we come and find there. And something that Philip Sato has brought out in particular is how in all that terribly elaborate and very skillful characterization of so many figures, one of the most skillful characterizations of all is of Plutarch himself, partly through the poems, partly through the voice, I suppose, in so many of the works. And it has been fascinating in several of these papers from Sophia and Metochites and others as well, to see how many of the people who owe most to Plutarch are developing themselves as a proto-Plutarch. And I remember a paper by Catherine MacDonald on Chryserius a few years ago, bringing out that in his version, his Latin translation, I think, there were so many echoes of what Plutarch had said about his response to the various heroes he's been talking about. So that degree of self-projection is picking up on something that's genuinely there. It was interesting to see how much the Institutio Traiani was coming out, and this was an emphasis in several papers yesterday, particularly again Fred's paper last night, and how this came out so much in dedications, Philemon Holland's dedication to James I as well, echoing all that. So there's perhaps a double-hander here. It's a diptych, if you like. It's not merely the self-projection of Plutarch or the author imitating Plutarch, but also the dedicatee, the casting as Trajan. The casting as Trajan with perhaps an implication that of what sort of patronage would be awfully nice to follow for the relationship between the two, but the projection of a relationship as well. Interesting, again, picking up on Fran's last paper here, Simon Goldhill's category of politics and history as where you go for Plutarch, for lessons about that. And I suppose I was reflecting on this last night, but one thing that would be seen to come out of the papers that we'd had up till that point, the aspects that had been highlighted, was perhaps a certain blandness, but the lessons were actually very uplifting and very inspiring and pretty utopian, a bit rosy-eyed. And perhaps indeed this might tie in with Fran's monster. And if we're talking about particularly Numa and Lycurgus and so on, yes, it may be that these are simply the early ones or in that volume, but they're also the lawgivers, the utopian planners for their various states. It's that sort of politics and history would contrast, I suppose, about the way that some authors are being used. Just think about contemporary use of Thucydides by neocons. Just think about the way in which Tacitus is being used with edge to take lessons that have real bite on contemporary politics. And more of that has come out today, I suppose, particularly in Rosie and Edith's paper, on Plutarch as offering at least a meat for revolutionary thinking as well, things that are anything but bland, liberty thinking in that particular way. And I'm sure that's a very important aspect of that. It's interesting that it is liberty. In a way, I suppose, the Gracchi are not the most obvious place to go if you're looking for inspiring stuff on liberty, and it wasn't the only place that people did go. I suppose Brutus and Cato Minor, these liberty fighters, Philopoemen as well, perhaps less exploited. I don't know enough about the reception of Philopoemen, but where you've got real freedom fighters, in Plutarch's presentation, the Gracchi are not particularly fighting for freedom. They're fighting for reform. They're fighting, it's a class warfare, but perhaps not quite so much freedom. But that, in a sense, is only an element, I suppose, of a much broader theme. The way that so much of the hard-edged political thinking that can come out of Plutarch is almost reading against the grain. Even the Brutus and Cato. Yes, Plutarch, if one thinks of the lives themselves, is extremely sensitive. He's almost sympathetic to the motives, where Brutus and Cato are coming from, trying to stick to principles in a world which is not leaving much room for principles, but at the same time we're not left in much doubt that they're wrong. They're fundamentally wrong. They're wrong with a capital R. It's because history is against them. History is moving towards the Roman state. So yet there's with this feeling of people who are instinct with liberty fighting, freedom fighting with their cause, even in cases, it's in sense of the Gracchi as well, where there's a pretty clear indication that Plutarch eventually might drop a verdict against them. There's stuff there that can really be bitten on, can really be used. And I suppose in a way that in itself which is something quite interesting about Plutarch's own text, a sort of open-endedness, if you like, that you can read against the grain, you can understand viewpoints, that are eventually not necessarily those that the authorial voice will come down on. And I suppose that can extend to things like Coriolanus. It's come out several times today, the way in which Shakespeare's Coriolanus, again picking up on themes from Edith and Rosie's paper, really makes an awful lot about grain crises in the early 1600s. Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, with so much of really hard-edged discussion of republicanism, the case for monarchy, the case against monarchy. In each case, perhaps going further than the Plutarch text goes, but still providing the material to do so. And in terms of censorship, again, the theme of today, the way in which Julius Caesar plays are pretty well banned in Britain, if I remember rightly, from about 1660 through to about 1715, with the Duke of Buckingham basing plays on on Plutarch Caesar, has to take them to Italy to be performed rather than using them in Britain. There is more than simple blandness then in Plutarch's politics, and also a capacity for all these different ways of looking at things. So why did people, well, I've already been wittering on a bit about why people might go to Plutarch. How can we know? Part of what I've been talking about so far is pretty explicit in the things that people have been quoting. Already we're talking about imitations, though, and it's quite interesting what Judith was talking about yesterday in these lives that are completing Plutarch's lives. Quite interesting in all sorts of ways about respect for authorship, who owns books, is one actually... Is it some sort of fraud, or is it just being helpful to an audience? All sorts of things in the air there. But it's also an interesting way of actually capturing again what people found attractive in Plutarch. I remember, this reminds me a bit of a review that Christopher Jones wrote in 1973-74 of Donald Russell's wonderful general book on Plutarch, which is, of course, a very appreciative review. But it also commented reflectively that, yes, it's interesting all the same, but people need to write and read books like this now. We didn't need to be told a generation ago, several generations ago, that Plutarch was a great writer. We just went and read Plutarch. And this, again, may be part of the reason for the Plutarch bubble, but it's time to actually explain why Plutarch is so good instead of just feeling it instinctively. But instead of actually writing essays on Tacitus's style, it goes back to the time, I suppose, where a natural exercise was, don't write about it, just write a prose in the style of Tacitus. There's still a lot of that when I started my career. I remember setting university prize exercises on Tacitus sums up the career and achievement of either President Nixon or President Amin. That was quite a good one. A Socius Imperi for Kissinger, I remember. We could do that now, couldn't we? Tiberius on his deathbed advises David Cameron on how to deal with seditious senators. It'd be quite an interesting exercise, really. But going back to those imitations, seeing what people found in Plutarch and seeing what they perhaps didn't imitate so well is an interesting point that the Hannibal in particular had a lot more direct characterization. It's not so easy to write in Plutarch's style. But that again is interesting for that point of why go to Plutarch. The strong visual aspect, and this is where Maddalena's reading out of Guerrini's paper was very helpful, I think, to see the strong response to the visuality that is there in Plutarch's life. Again, the theatricality, again, Rosie and Edith's paper. All these are features of Plutarch, which are more clear, I suppose, in the imitations and what people pick up to imitate than in actually explicit talk about Plutarch. And I suppose, in a sense, imitation, the self-fashioning as well, that picks up on the imitation point. While we're on visual art, it may be coming around to things that are not picked up. And it was very interesting, I think, just in what Madalena was giving us this morning, that notion of cycles, biographical cycles, again, very Plutarchian, as they pick themes from an individual's life. Started thinking, I suppose, possibly about the interaction here of sacred and secular art as well, of themes from saints' lives, themes from the life of Christ, and how far this influences those sorts of presentation. But a point at the beginning of that, of how there was also a tradition of uomini famosi, of famous men, the notion of a series of lives, which is so important in Plutarch, I suppose, and not just in Plutarch, in Diogenes Laertius, the notion that you might find an extremely interesting way of doing history to see a whole series of lives, one after another. That doesn't seem to have been picked up so much in this or in any of the papers we've heard so far. It doesn't mean it's not there, because there's just so much there. But it was an interesting gap there. Finally, before we leave this, why go to Plutarch? Very interesting, isn't it, that Plutarch's, and I think this came out of Alberto Rigolio's paper, the first one yesterday, was so attractive to early Christians and also into Byzantine Christians with Sophia's paper. And why was that? Why should it be so attractive a text? May indeed be the high moral tone, a point that Sophia made. Is it more than that? Is it also the style? Again, the anecdotes, the exemplariness. It's almost diatribe style. It's a sort of similarity of, some similarity between those practical philosophy and sermon style. I'm not sure. And if there is that this point about the mindset of the authors or mindset of the audience? I'm not sure, but it's feeling why there should be an attractiveness in that that sort of period to that sort of market. Maybe for different reasons than the Renaissance humanists, the range of interests that was so attractive in the Renaissance period, may be different too from what we may find today. Sensitivities to what Plutarch is doing. Perhaps I'll just move on in the last few minutes of anything in these witterings, of things that we might find important about Plutarch, but don't seem to have been picked up in anything that we've heard. But there's a terrific health warning, as if it haven't been brought out in the papers. So much has been brought out in the papers. It may well be it's out there, and I'd be very grateful. We'd all be for his thoughts on that. The pairings, the interest in pairings, indeed in the whatever the book that was or wasn't in the satchel. It's interesting that first volume of Amio is already splitting up the pairs, and there's no need there felt to put all the pairs together, just as for modern penguins, for good and for ill, split them all up for marketing reasons. May have been similar marketing reasons then, I don't know. But we've perhaps had one example with the Guerrini today, where there's a sort of, at least noticing what's in the other life, but the interest in the pairing strategy, like the interest in the series, doesn't seem to be something that has been picked up particularly. And I suppose if one thinks about other ways in which contemporary scholarship presents us with a rather different sort of Plutarch from the Plutarch of 50 years ago, the interest, several of us, particularly Tim Duff, I suppose, in moralism, with much more open-ended moralism, not actually teaching go there and act likewise, do likewise sort of moralism, but this is really morally problematic. Let's all work it all out. I think the inspirational sort of qualities we've seen aren't quite that sort of moralism. It's a rather more straightforward type of moralism that people have been picking up in that presentation of Plutarch as teacher, moral teacher, with more positive, less problematic and less aporia-ridden moral lessons there. Now, what we make of that, I don't know. Do we feel immensely smug and think, yeah, we've got so much closer to the real Plutarch than all earlier generations, or is that a warning sign that perhaps we're making Plutarch a little bit too much like ourselves and a bit less like previous generations, or is that what we're inevitably going to do and perhaps we should just ride with it? who knows? But it's interesting what we don't get. Interesting the books. This is, I suppose, is pretty well my final point. But we haven't heard very much about, again, without health warning, that it may well be real reception of all sorts of Plutarch works out there, but just don't happen to have come up. But when there's so much on education, it's interesting that the work that's, apart from the Instituto Traiani, as that presentation of a teacher, the one that seems to get all the airspace is the one we don't think was by Plutarch, the De Liberis Educandis. When there's so much on education in De Audiendo or De Audiendis Poetis, how you listen to literature, how you Plutarch himself on exemplariness, of how you respond to the exemplar in literature. Hasn't come up very much. I'm sure there is a reception out there, but it doesn't. It's interesting. It doesn't seem to have been primary to all these very interesting talks about Plutarch and the learning process that's come up in different aspects today. Religion, so important to the Plutarch that we think we know. The Delphic essays, so much religious spirit there. Plutarch the priest. We haven't had very much on that. I mean, it may be because of the Christianization, but there's authors like Lucretius who are very anti-Christian. The Christian tradition has tended to be domesticating, accommodating Lucretius with what they had to say, picking out the bits that really chime in, whereas the Plutarch that we've heard of in the last 2 days tends to be sidestepping that sort of issue, I suppose. Not very much on the serious philosophy, the Stoic, the Epicurean, more on the serious, more professional philosophy. I'm not saying that the works like De Bendaira and so on are not serious, but you know what I mean. This is the more immediate and accessible types of philosophy. Not very much on the, hardly anything, I think, on the Quaestiones Convivales. So attractive, so interesting. Despite the interest in Miscellanistic literature, despite the interest that Francis was bringing out in Problemata literature, but you've got in the ITI, Chromeakai and whatever it is, Hellenon, Hellenicae. Are they not being read so much? Is that a matter of book availability? I don't know, but it's quite interesting that they haven't come up very much. And on politics, I suppose, as well, the sort of politics we've been hearing about is much more big-scale politics, mirrors for princes. Not the sort of politics which are much more small-town-based, but the Praecepta Republicae Gerundae really seem to be more concerned with how you deal with an assembly in quite a small town, how you hoodwink them. Mirrors for princes, then, seems to have been what people have been talking about, at least in the last 2 days, not quite mirrors for magistrates or mirrors for the small town rather than the big town politician. I mean, that may be, again, just trying to extract the biggest lessons for the biggest audience out of Plutarch, but an interesting gap. And I think, finally, one wouldn't want to lose track of a very interesting question that Freya Cox Jensen asked at the end of last night. If there's so much more reception, much more interest, more books being sold in Italy and Netherlands and England, and so many fewer in France and Germany, why? What is that? Is that a genuine reflection of interest, or is it perhaps the other way around, the lack of availability of books means, unsurprisingly, they're not being read? And how much does that map into the modern scholarship? There are national differences, much less Plutarch scholarship in Germany than anywhere else. I wonder if that has continuity with the sort of thing that Constanze was talking about earlier on today, of German scholarship shying away from Plutarch in the 19th century. I don't know, plenty of questions there, but I've spoken for slightly longer than I intended, not for the first time. Just let me throw it open for the last 10 minutes or so.